Philip K. Dick's novel Ubik, which was published in 1969, centers around two rivaling agencies. One is the telepath agency, which is, I guess, born from a phenomenon that is not really explained fully, but you think maybe there's been some kind of biological enhancement or shift in people that at least gives them the illusion of telepathy, or indeed they may have that ability. It's not clear. But then there's another warring agency that is anti-telepath and also anti-espionage, because indeed telepathy is used for many clandestine kinds of activities, which is what the Runciter agency, the anti-espionage one, is trying to overcome. And this, of course, is never an issue that is never resolved, but the story, as it does in many of Philip K. Dick's novels, just goes down a rabbit hole that becomes increasingly frightening and less easy to understand. And Runciter's wife is also in a state of what is called half-life, because she has died, but her consciousness has been downloaded into, it's not even really clear what it is. It's some sort of quantum field, electromagnetic field that is technologically created so that he can communicate with his wife. This also raises a lot of other questions that for me kind of were akin to that to be or not to be speech. And what makes it even more daunting is that science is taking it into its own hands to be able to provide a very simple, easy solution to all of those, our worst fears and our worst insecurities. But I'll get into that a little bit later. I think really what stood out to me the most about this book was something that I notice more generally, more commonly, is a very sharp distinction between science fiction and fantasy and fairy tales. And both of these distinctions, I think, are equally beautiful and powerful, but I think they serve their own very unique purposes, obviously. And I would say that, for example, in fairy tales or fantasy, whenever there's a ripple in reality, whenever things don't make sense, or things are irrational, you always feel like there's some sort of invisible hand that's kind of holding everything together. So you feel like, well, somehow, you don't really know how, but things are going to work out, kind of like in the same way that you think of something like divine providence or like God. And I guess, for example, in Through the Looking Glass, Alice in Wonderland, it's as absurd and illogical as it becomes. You're there to enjoy the ride, right? You almost feel like you're in this giant sort of glorified fun house, and you just want to see what happens next. But in science fiction, on the other hand, and this is a big trademark, a big feature in this book, is that whenever things don't make sense, you feel a kind of an existential dread. You feel like you're just getting sucked further and further away from that sense of comfort, that sense of familiarity that you have with things, and you also sense that all you have to rely on is yourself. Like in this case, the individual, the protagonist, right? You don't have anything else, because when you look at things from a scientific point of view, it is more about only having yourself. It's not. There isn't that sense of there being some kind of invisible hand, some kind that makes things happen, or and that's what I think is the most interesting to me about it. And it's also what I think is obviously the most daunting thing about this story, is that there's the whole time, and I won't give too much of it away, obviously, but there's the characters start to see that reality becomes warped, and they see their allies and friends and enemies appearing and reappearing in different places. Their age suddenly, they're rapidly aging, and the atmosphere of this entire world is obviously, like in many of his stories, suspicious, because it raises a lot of political insecurities and questions about mainly about technocracy. As I've mentioned, it's because you sense in this story that the technocracy is taking like a basically creating its own Frankenstein creature. It's like taking a lot of our worst fears and uncertainties into its own hands and then promising people basically this sort of snake oil kind of product. And it gets even worse when people supposedly get the solution, which is the product called Ubik, the spray that is able to reverse all of these ripples in the time-space continuum. But it obviously, in the end, it doesn't actually really pay off. Their situation doesn't really become any better, um, and the entire reality, the entire structure of that world ends up seeming like a complete ripoff, and you're left feeling cheated, and which also makes it very clear that there probably was some sort of technocratic or political agenda behind creating the world in the way that it is, and whether people or not are biologically able to have even some of these abilities, such as telepathy, uh, is not very clear. Um, but it certainly, though, creates a very deceptively beautiful world at the beginning. Very simple, um, almost very commercialized and plasticky, very Stepford. Um, but then it just takes you into a total nightmare, and you don't know whether you're going to get out. So I would, it's a very exciting story. I would highly recommend it.